Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to another edition of Yesterday's Sports on the Sports History Network. Last week, we talked about the 1976 New England Patriots, one of the best teams from the 1970s that did not play in the Super Bowl. Now we have another team from 1976 that also did not reach the Super Bowl, but are considered one of the best teams of the 1970s. That would be the 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers. The 1976 season got off to an excellent start for the defending Super Bowl champions, or so it seemed. Victory seemed to be in the bag when the Steelers sprinted out to a comfortable fourth quarter lead, 28-14 against the Oakland Raiders. But the Raiders staged a furious comeback, scoring 17 unanswered points to win the game 31-28. Things seemed to be back to normal the following week when Pittsburgh scored an easy 31-14 win over the Cleveland Browns. But the Steelers then went on a 3-game losing skid. To make matters worse, starting quarterback Terry Bradshaw suffered an injury in the 5th game. One more loss, and the 1-4 Steelers could kiss the playoffs goodbye. How could a team that had won consecutive Super Bowls be facing dire straits? Some thought the team was still suffering a hangover from their hard-fought victory over the Dallas Cowboys in the Super Bowl. But one thing was for sure. The 1976 team had lost 4 games to excellent teams: Oakland, Minnesota, New England, and Cleveland. Oakland would go on to win the Super Bowl that year, and Minnesota won the NFC Championship. New England went 11-3 and qualified for the playoffs, and Cleveland finished with 9 wins and 5 losses. And quality opponents didn't end with that bunch. Dating back to mid-December of 1975, excluding preseason games, through mid-October of 1976, the Steelers had played 11 straight games against high-caliber teams. Pittsburgh won 7 of those 11 games, losing the other 4 by an average of only 5 points a game. Still, the cost is a huge part of the story. Playing top-notch teams week after week exacts a physical and mental toll. And now these Steelers had their collective backs against the wall. At 1-4, they had to beat the next team up, the 4-1 Cincinnati Bengals, and they did, 23-6. Important as that win was, it's not the big story of the Steelers' 1976 season. The Steelers not only won that game, but they also went on to beat every other team on the regular season schedule, converting a 1-4 start into a 10-4 finish. Here's how they did it. Pittsburgh followed the Bengals win with a trio of shutouts. The Giants, 27-0. The Chargers, with Bradshaw back at quarterback, 23-0. And the Chiefs, 45-0. In the next game, Pittsburgh almost made it 4 shutouts in a row when the Dolphins went down 14-3. Counting the Bengals game, the Steelers had not allowed a touchdown in 5 games, and the Steel Curtain had allowed only 3 field goals during that span. The Steelers were not only back, but better than ever. The shutout string ended in Week 11, but the Steelers still managed to double the score against the Oilers, 32-16. And that win set up a do-or-die showdown with the division-leading Cincinnati Bengals. Because the Steelers started 1-4, the division lead over Pittsburgh would have grown to 3 games had Cincinnati won the game. The result? Cincinnati would clinch the division, and the Steelers would drop into 3rd place behind the 8-4 Cleveland Browns, a team that had won earlier that day. The game was played at Riverfront Stadium on a cold, snowy day, and not surprisingly, it was a hard-hitting defensive battle. The Bengals took a 3-0 lead on a first-quarter field goal, and that lead held into the 3rd quarter, when Franco Harris scored from 4 yards out. Pittsburgh's 4-point lead, 7-3, was enough to grab the win, mainly because the Steel Curtain defense held the Cincinnati offense to just 225 total yards and forced 2 turnovers. That was the good news for Steelers fans. The bad news is that the Bengals still held the division lead, which meant Pittsburgh remained with its back to the wall. To respond, the team did what it had done before: throw shutouts. This time, consecutive shutouts against Tampa Bay in Week 13, and then in Week 14, Houston to close out the regular season. Both wins came by way of blowouts, too, to the tune of 63-0 total scores. Winning was necessary, but still not sufficient. The Bengals still held a 1-game division lead going into their Week 13 Monday night game against the Raiders. Pittsburgh needed Cincinnati to lose that game because winning the division was likely the only way the Steelers would get into the playoffs. That's because 3 other teams were in the race with the Steelers for a wild card berth. The Patriots and Colts both stood at 10-3, and Cleveland was 9-4. Winning the division was a sure way, and perhaps the only way, for the Steelers to get into the playoffs and defend their Super Bowl championship. Before the Monday night matchup between Oakland and Cincinnati, there was a lot of speculation that the Raiders, who had already clinched their division, might deliberately lose to the Bengals, thereby giving the Steelers little hope of making the playoffs. How did the division and playoff race turn out? The Bengals lost to the Raiders 35-20, and then overpowered the lowly Jets 42-3 the following week. Meanwhile, the Steelers closed out the campaign by shutting out the Oilers. Ending the season tied for first place in the division, Pittsburgh held the tiebreaker because the Steelers won both times against the Bengals. It was a bitter pill to swallow for the Bengals, too. They not only lost the division title, but they also failed to capture the wild card spot, which went to the Patriots. Now in the playoffs, the Steelers wanted to make the most of their good fortune, and they did. Despite facing the formidable 11-3 Baltimore Colts, Pittsburgh smashed the AFC East winner, 40-14, to score its 10th win in a row. Impressive as that was, perhaps even more impressive was how the Steelers played during that streak, winning games by an average score of 27-4. The 14-1 Oakland Raiders were up next in the AFC Championship game. The task, difficult enough as it was, became all the more challenging because Pittsburgh would have to play the game shorthanded. Both starting running backs Franco Harris and Rocky Bleier were injured against the Colts. The Steelers' 10-game winning streak ended that day as the Raiders walked away with a 24-7 victory. Some analysts and fans believe that the Steelers would have won if Franco and Rocky had played. Of course, that's speculative, and it might be wishful thinking too. After all, it's not like the Raiders had never been able to contain the Steelers' running game. They held Harris and Blyer to 95 yards in the 1975 AFC Championship, and they held them to 87 yards in a 1977 regular season game. The Steelers are not the only team to have played a championship game without two of their best players. For comparison, in the 1973 NFC Championship game, the Cowboys played the Vikings without two top players, running back Calvin Hill and defensive lineman Bob Lilly. Dallas lost by 17 points, 27-10. Would the Cowboys have been more competitive if Hill and Lilly had played? Yes, most likely. Would the Cowboys have won? No, probably not. I feel the same way about the Steelers versus the Raiders. Besides, it's important to give Oakland its due. A week later, the Raiders dominated the Vikings in Super Bowl XI, winning 32-14. That said, let's also give credit to the 1976 Steelers, a team that came back from the brink to play in the AFC Championship game. But there's another chapter in the story. How does the 1976 team stack up against the other Steelers teams of the 1970s? Furthermore, was the 1976 team the best Steelers squad ever? I've heard that said. Pittsburgh lost 5 games in 1976, and they didn't play in the Super Bowl that season. I don't rank the 1976 team above the Steelers Super Bowl winners of that era. In my book, the 1976 Pittsburgh Steelers had perhaps the most impressive 10-game win streak in NFL history. But 10 games does not a season make. That concludes our podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. God bless.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.